Lauren Brooks had always believed in fresh starts. After the death of her husband 2 years ago, she decided to leave behind the gray winters and fast pace of the city in search of a quieter, more hopeful life for herself and her 10-year-old daughter, Evie. They found it in the sleepy town of Willow Creek, a suburb with tree-lined streets, modest homes with well-tended lawns, and neighbors who waved at each other in passing. It was, Lauren thought, the perfect place to heal, to rebuild, and to give Evie the kind of carefree childhood she deserved. Their new home was a small, charming bungalow with faded green shutters and a wide front porch that begged for lazy summer afternoons spent sipping lemonade. From the moment Lauren saw it, she imagined a future full of simpler days, birthdays celebrated with backyard parties, and the soothing routine of a peaceful neighborhood. For the first few weeks, everything seemed to fall into place. Lauren set up her small flower business, working with local vendors to secure space at the farmers' market, while Evie threw herself into the thrill of exploring their new neighborhood. She loved riding her bright pink bicycle up and down the sidewalks, practicing tricks and challenging herself to go faster, farther, daring herself with the giddy fearlessness only a 10-year-old could have. Lauren would often watch from the porch, her heart swelling with happiness every time Evie's laughter rang through the quiet street. It was the first time in a long time that Lauren truly felt they might be okay. But life, as Lauren had learned, had a way of testing hope the moment it dared to bloom. Karen Whitmore lived 2 houses down. At 62 years old, Karen had long since passed from merely being a stickler for rules into being their self-appointed enforcer. She was a heavy-set woman with a permanent scowl etched into her ruddy cheeks, whose voice, thick and sharp, carried easily over the otherwise peaceful street. Karen's reputation as the neighborhood busybody preceded her, although Lauren initially hoped the rumors were exaggerated. Perhaps Karen was just misunderstood, Lauren thought. Perhaps the isolation of getting older had hardened her demeanor. Lauren, always one to give people the benefit of the doubt, smiled politely whenever they crossed paths, even when Karen's eyes narrowed disapprovingly at the sight of Evie riding her bike. It didn't take long for the first warning shot to be fired. A week after they moved in, Lauren found a handwritten note stuffed into her mailbox. Please remind your daughter that the sidewalks are for walking, not for creating a nuisance. There was no signature, but Lauren didn't need one. She tucked the note away without telling Evie, unwilling to dampen her daughter's enthusiasm. Children should be allowed to be children, Lauren thought fiercely. Still, she encouraged Evie to stay mindful of her surroundings, hoping to avoid any real confrontation. That fragile peace lasted until the evening it all went wrong. It was a warm Saturday, and Evie was practicing riding one-handed, gleefully shouting to Lauren to watch her. Lauren, arranging a bouquet on the porch table, called back her encouragement. In the golden glow of sunset, Evie steered carefully past Karen's driveway, wobbling slightly but regaining her balance. Just as she passed the edge of Karen's front walk, Lauren saw a flash of movement. Karen storming down the front steps like a bull seeing red. Without hesitation, without warning, she shoved Evie off her bicycle with both hands. The force was enough to send the girl sprawling onto the concrete, her knees and palms scraping loudly against the rough surface. The sound of Evie's body hitting the ground cracked through the air, followed by her sharp, stunned cry. Time froze. For one horrifying second, Lauren stood frozen, bouquet slipping from her fingers onto the porch. Then she ran. She sprinted across the lawn, her heart hammering against her ribs as she dropped to her knees beside Evie. Blood oozed from an angry scrape on Evie's elbow, and the little girl was trembling, biting her lip to keep from sobbing. Lauren gathered her into her arms, her breath shallow with shock and fury. Karen, meanwhile, stood above them, arms crossed over her ample chest, nostrils flaring in self-righteous indignation. She was making too much noise, Karen barked before Lauren could speak. I warned you people. This is a quiet neighborhood. We don't need reckless children disturbing everyone. Lauren stared at her, stunned beyond words. Her mind, usually so quick and organized, stumbled over itself. There was no apology, no concern for the bleeding child at her feet, only venom and rage spilling from Karen's twisted mouth. When Lauren finally found her voice, it was low and trembling with restrained fury. "You laid your hands on my daughter." The words tasted like rust on her tongue. "She had it coming," Karen snapped, turning on her heel and marching back toward her house as if she had done nothing more serious than chase a stray cat off her property. Lauren clutched Evie tighter and fought the instinct to charge after Karen. No, not here, not now. There were better ways to deal with people like her. Controlled ways, ways that mattered. Lauren carried Evie to the car parked at the curb, carefully buckling her into the passenger seat. Evie clutched Lauren's hand tightly, her small fingers trembling. Lauren kissed the top of her daughter's head and promised herself she would fix this. She would not let this stand. At the urgent care clinic, Lauren insisted on a full examination. The doctor, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, gently cleaned Evie's wounds and assured Lauren that nothing was broken, though the scrapes were deep and would take time to heal. Lauren requested written documentation of the injuries, dates, measurements, detailed descriptions. When the doctor asked if Lauren wanted a police report filed, Lauren hesitated only for a second before nodding. Absolutely. She wasn't going to give Karen the chance to turn this around or minimize it later. Back home, Lauren put Evie to bed with a kiss and a whispered promise that everything would be okay. Then, when the house was finally still and dark, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the official papers spread out before her. Her hands shook with the aftershocks of adrenaline and rage. She had seen ugliness before, in the slow, cruel way cancer had claimed her husband, but this was a different kind of cruelty. Cold, deliberate, and almost gleeful. Lauren knew she couldn't let it slide, not just for Evie, but for herself, for every silent person who had endured Karen's venom without fighting back. There would be no more ignoring notes in the mailbox, no more giving the benefit of the doubt. Karen had crossed a line, and Lauren intended to make sure she paid for it. Not with screaming matches on the lawn or petty revenge, but with the weight of real consequences, the kind that left marks on more than just skin. As Lauren gathered the papers into a folder, preparing to visit the police department first thing in the morning, she caught her reflection in the dark window above the sink. Her face was pale but set with grim determination. She didn't look like the woman who had moved here for a peaceful life. She looked like a woman ready for battle. And in that moment, Lauren realized that sometimes peace had to be fought for. Tooth and nail, with a steady hand and an unbreakable will. Outside, the neighborhood lay silent under a canopy of stars. Somewhere down the street, behind a drawn curtain and a locked door, Karen Whitmore slept soundly, unaware that the ground beneath her carefully controlled world had begun to shift. Lauren Brooks was coming for her, not with fists or fury, but with the slow, relentless power of justice, and no amount of shouting was going to stop her. The next morning broke gray and cold, a heavy mist lingering low over Willow Creek, cloaking the town in a damp stillness that seemed to seep into Lauren's bones as she dressed quietly and tiptoed around the house, careful not to wake Evie. The bruises on her daughter's small body had darkened overnight, turning angry shades of purple and blue along her knees and elbows, and seeing them renewed Lauren's fury, sharpening her focus into something dangerously precise. Today would not be about grief or anger. It would be about action. Lauren arrived at the Willow Creek Police Department just after it opened, carrying with her a neatly organized folder of documents. Evie's medical records, photographs of her injuries taken with a timestamp, and her own detailed written account of the attack. The officer at the front desk, a young man barely out of his academy training by the looks of him, blinked as she introduced herself and requested to file a formal complaint of assault against Karen Whitmore. He glanced down at the folder she offered and hesitated, shifting awkwardly as if already anticipating trouble. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'll take your report, but just to set expectations, it's sometimes difficult to move forward with charges and disputes between neighbors unless there's clear and compelling evidence." Lauren leaned slightly over the Counter, lowering her voice but letting the intensity of her conviction bleed through every word. My daughter was physically assaulted while riding her bicycle on a public sidewalk. This was not a dispute. This was not an accident. This was an adult laying hands on a child out of pure anger. Something in her tone, in the cold steadiness of her gaze, seemed to galvanize the young officer. He nodded and motioned for her to follow him into a small, windowless interview room where a second officer, older and heavier set, joined them. Lauren repeated everything, slowly, methodically, without letting her voice waver, as they recorded her statement and photographed the evidence she had brought. It took more than an hour, but by the time she left, a case number was in her hand, and a tentative sense of vindication fluttered somewhere deep in her chest. It was a small victory, but Lauren knew better than to believe the battle was over. She had lived long enough to understand that some people, when challenged, doubled down rather than retreating. Karen Whitmore, she suspected, was exactly that kind of person. Her suspicion was confirmed sooner than she would have thought possible. That very afternoon, as Lauren returned from picking up a few groceries, she noticed something odd pinned to her front door. An official-looking notice printed on heavy stock paper with the town seal embossed faintly at the top. It informed her that a noise complaint had been filed against her household and that an inspection would be conducted to ensure compliance with town ordinances regarding residential disturbances. Lauren stood on her porch reading and rereading the notice, the blood draining from her face. It was dated that morning, filed not 24 hours after Karen had shoved Evie to the ground. The coincidence was too precise to be anything but calculated retaliation. Karen had wasted no time in trying to flip the narrative, weaponizing the very institutions Lauren had hoped would protect her. The letter included vague allegations, excessive noise at inappropriate hours, reckless behavior by minors, obstruction of public pathways. It was a masterclass in vague, bureaucratic language designed to make anyone receiving it feel automatically guilty. Lauren's hands tightened around the paper until the edges crumpled slightly. She closed her eyes, inhaling slowly, forcing herself not to march directly to Karen's door and unleash the fury boiling inside her. No, that was what Karen would expect, perhaps even what she hoped for. An outburst could be twisted, manipulated into more ammunition against her. Instead, Lauren called the police station again, referencing the case number she had been given that morning. She explained the sudden appearance of the noise complaint and expressed concern that it was retaliatory in nature. The desk sergeant listened carefully and advised her to document everything, every interaction, every notice, every suspicious event, and to report any further harassment immediately. While the police could not prevent someone from filing a complaint, the sergeant explained, patterns of behavior could be used to establish harassment, especially if tied to an ongoing legal matter. Lauren hung up and immediately began a new folder labeled simply, Whitmore. Into it, she placed a copy of the complaint, along with detailed notes about the timeline of events. She also downloaded a free app on her phone that recorded timestamps of ambient noise levels. If Karen wanted to claim noise violations, Lauren would have a digital log proving otherwise. Still, she knew Karen wouldn't stop there. And she was right. The following morning, Lauren woke to find her garbage bins overturned and their contents scattered across her driveway. Banana peels, coffee grounds, wilted flower stems, and bits of soggy paper formed a disgusting mosaic that looked almost deliberate in its distribution. It could have been an accident, strong winds perhaps, or a stray animal. But deep down, Lauren knew it was no accident. Not after the notice, not after everything. She cleaned up the mess in grim silence, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs with each piece she stuffed into a fresh trash bag. The humiliation of being made a target in her own home was raw, searing, but she refused to let it crack her composure. If Karen expected a dramatic confrontation, she would be disappointed. That afternoon, while Evie was at a friend's house, Lauren walked down to the town clerk's office. She requested copies of all recent complaints filed against her address. Not just the noise complaint, but anything else. She learned, to her disbelief, that 2 additional complaints had been logged anonymously. One alleging improper maintenance of her property, ridiculous considering she spent hours tending to her front garden, and another claiming that her daughter had menaced passers-by with reckless bike riding. Lauren's vision blurred for a moment with rage, and she had to grip the counter to steady herself. She paid the small copying fee and left with a thick sheaf of paperwork under her arm, her mind racing. Karen wasn't just trying to punish her. She was trying to build a case against her, an artificial record of violations that could be used to pressure her into leaving the neighborhood altogether. For a moment, fear gnawed at Lauren's resolve. What if Karen succeeded? What if the constant harassment and mounting complaints made it impossible to stay? Moving again would crush Evie, who had already endured more upheaval than any child should. Lauren tightened her grip on the folder. No, she had not uprooted her life, had not fought through grief and loneliness and fear, only to be bullied out of the home she was trying so desperately to build. When she got home, she called her attorney, a woman named Michelle Parsons, who had a reputation for being tenacious and unflinching in the face of harassment cases. Lauren explained everything in a low, measured voice, pacing her kitchen as she spoke. Michelle listened intently, asking pointed questions, and then said something that sparked the first real flicker of hope Lauren had felt in days. "This isn't just a matter for civil court," Michelle said. "If we can show that these complaints are retaliatory, that they're an extension of the original assault, we might be able to escalate this into a case of civil harassment or even malicious prosecution." Lauren's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't dared hope that Karen's relentless cruelty could turn back on her legally, but Michelle's confidence was contagious. They agreed on a plan. Document everything meticulously, respond formally to each complaint with evidence refuting the claims, and file a cross-complaint asserting harassment if the pattern continued. It would take time, patience, and an iron will, but Lauren was ready for it. She spent that evening gathering every scrap of evidence she had, emails from the town, photographs of her meticulously trimmed lawn, timestamps of ambient noise levels, statements from friendly neighbors who had seen nothing out of the ordinary. She built her case piece by piece, stone by stone, until it stood like a fortress around her. Late that night, after Evie had gone to bed, Lauren sat on the porch wrapped in a light blanket, sipping lukewarm tea as she stared out into the misty darkness. Somewhere down the street, Karen's porch light glowed sullenly through the fog like a watchful eye. Lauren's muscles ached from exhaustion, and her mind churned with restless thoughts, but she refused to surrender to despair. Instead, she made herself a promise, one she whispered into the cold night air like a vow. Karen Whitmore had made a huge mistake. She had mistaken Lauren's kindness for weakness, her patience for passivity, her hope for naivety. But Lauren was none of those things. Not anymore. She would not break. She would not run. And she would not, under any circumstances, allow Karen Whitmore to define the life she was building for herself and for Evie. The days that followed were like moving through a minefield. Lauren knew something was coming, even if she couldn't see it yet. The air in the neighborhood had changed. Thicker somehow, heavier, carrying a sense of brewing confrontation. Karen Whitmore had gone quiet, which was in itself a warning. Lauren didn't trust that silence. She knew it was the kind that preceded storms. The first strike came during the Willow Creek Saturday market, where Lauren had spent weeks preparing a new flower stall. It wasn't just a business venture. It was a personal milestone, a declaration that she and Evie were planting roots here, becoming part of the community. Lauren had labored over every detail, from hand-painted signs to carefully arranged bouquets of fresh peonies and daisies, the colors a vibrant shout of hope against the somber backdrop of recent events. Evie, proudly wearing a little apron embroidered with flowers, was by her side, giggling as she helped set up the stand. Everything was unfolding perfectly until Karen appeared. She lumbered toward them, her wide figure wrapped in a sagging mauve dress that clung uncomfortably to her bulk. She wore an expression of theatrical innocence, but there was a glint in her eye that Lauren immediately recognized. Malice barely disguised as civility. Karen hovered near the edge of Lauren's stall, pretending to browse, her heavy hands brushing too close to the fragile displays. Lauren kept her distance, unwilling to engage. Then, with the deftness of a woman who had spent years mastering petty sabotage, Karen, accidentally, knocked over an entire shelf of delicate ceramic vases Lauren had arranged at the corner of the stall. The crash was deafening. Shards of pottery and sprays of flowers exploded across the pavement, drawing startled gasps from nearby shoppers. Lauren froze for a heartbeat, then dropped to her knees, hastily gathering the wreckage as the market manager, a thin, balding man named Mr. Carlton, rushed over. Before Lauren could explain, Karen launched into a loud, dramatic monologue about unsafe setups and reckless displays endangering the public, her voice thick with feigned concern. She painted Lauren as irresponsible, careless, an outsider bringing chaos to their peaceful little market. Carlton, a man more concerned with avoiding complaints than investigating truth, glanced nervously between them before offering Karen an appeasing nod and informing Lauren that she would need to rethink her display strategies before returning. Humiliated but determined not to cause a scene, Lauren gathered the ruined remnants of her stall, blinking back furious tears as she felt the curious, judgmental eyes of other vendors on her back. Evie, clutching a broken daisy stem, looked up at her mother with wide, confused eyes. Lauren knelt and hugged her tightly, whispering promises that they would not let one bitter woman ruin what they had built. But inside, Lauren's fury simmered hotter than ever. Karen had moved beyond personal attacks. She was now attacking Lauren's livelihood, her dreams, and, by extension, Evie's future. It was no longer just about hurt feelings or neighborly disputes. It was a full-fledged campaign of destruction. Lauren's lawyer, Michelle, was unsurprised when Lauren recounted the incident. "People like her escalate when they sense they're losing control," she said matter-of-factly. Michelle advised Lauren to stay calm, continue documenting everything meticulously, and not give Karen any ammunition by reacting emotionally in public. It was sage advice, but difficult to follow when every nerve in Lauren's body screamed for confrontation. The next wave came 2 days later. Lauren had just finished watering the flower beds in the front yard when she noticed Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, staring at her house. There was something unnervingly blank about her expression, as if she were mentally calculating her next move. Lauren refused to meet her gaze and continued her work, pretending not to notice. Minutes later, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street and pulled up in front of her driveway. The officer stepped out and approached with a clipboard. "Ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "we've received a report of excessive water runoff from your property creating unsafe conditions on the sidewalk." Lauren blinked in disbelief, then glanced toward the perfectly dry concrete. The officer seemed uncomfortable as he handed her a formal warning notice, explaining that while there was no visible violation now, they were required to respond to all complaints and document the interaction. Lauren accepted the notice with a tight smile, her hands trembling slightly. Across the street, Karen turned and waddled back into her house, her shoulders shaking with laughter Lauren didn't need to hear to understand. The pattern was unmistakable. Every time Lauren regained a little ground, Karen struck another blow, always indirect, always through some petty bureaucratic mechanism that forced Lauren to waste time, energy, and dignity defending herself against absurdities. Yet Lauren refused to retreat. She installed a discreet dashcam inside her car to record her daily comings and goings, capturing timestamps and images of her property in pristine condition. She kept meticulous logs of every incident. She filed counter notices responding to every complaint with evidence and politely worded rebuttals. Michelle submitted formal harassment notices to the town clerk's office, demanding that a pattern of frivolous, retaliatory complaints be recognized. It was exhausting. It was humiliating. But Lauren pressed on, and still, Karen wasn't finished. One Thursday morning, Lauren returned from a grocery run to find a small, ugly scene staged in her front yard. Dozens of dead flowers dumped across her lawn, trampled into the grass. At first, she thought it might be the work of local teenagers, a cruel prank. But among the crushed blossoms, Lauren found something that made her blood run cold. A single, wilted daisy, tied with twine around a scrap of cardboard bearing one word, scrawled in angry block letters: menace. The meaning was clear. Karen wanted her gone, and she was escalating beyond complaints and sabotage into psychological warfare. Lauren called Michelle immediately. Within an hour, Michelle had filed for a temporary restraining order against Karen, citing a documented pattern of harassment, destruction of property, and intimidation tactics. It was a long shot. Judges were notoriously cautious about granting such orders in neighbor disputes, but it was a necessary move. When the court date was set for the following week, Lauren felt both relieved and terrified. It would be a public confrontation, and she would have to lay bare every humiliation, every violation she had endured. But it would also be a chance to finally put Karen's behavior under legal scrutiny. As she prepared her case, Lauren received an unexpected boost. Two neighbors, an elderly couple who lived down the block, reached out quietly, offering their own stories of harassment at Karen's hands. She had, it seemed, a long history of petty vindictiveness, calling animal control over non-existent barking dogs, reporting children for playing too loudly, filing nuisance complaints about Halloween decorations. The couple provided written statements describing how they too had been targeted when they refused to kowtow to Karen's imagined authority. Their words painted a damning picture of a woman who had spent years terrorizing the very community she claimed to protect. Lauren gathered all the pieces: photographs, reports, statements, the broken vases, the dead flowers, and wove them into a tapestry of relentless harassment that even the most skeptical judge would find difficult to ignore. The night before the court date, Lauren sat at her kitchen table staring at the stack of evidence she had built. Evie slept upstairs, her small, steady breathing a reminder of why Lauren was fighting so hard. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen would not back down quietly. People like her never did. But Lauren also knew that she was no longer the woman who had once stuffed an angry note into a drawer and hoped for the best. She was stronger now, forged by necessity, tempered by fury, and armed not with rage, but with resolve. Outside, Willow Creek slumbered under a thick, misty sky. The houses stood in neat rows, their lights glowing softly against the night, unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the quiet war being waged within their midst. Lauren closed the last file folder, her hands steady. Tomorrow, she thought, the real fight begins. The courtroom was smaller than Lauren had imagined, almost intimate, with scuffed wooden floors and rows of worn benches where a few curious spectators and local reporters sat whispering behind their hands. It smelled faintly of dust and old paper, and as Lauren stood with Michelle by her side, she realized with sudden clarity that this was not going to be a dramatic showdown or a sweeping gesture of justice. It would be a slow, methodical grind of facts and patience, the kind of battle won not with passion, but with precision. Across the aisle, Karen sat slouched in her chair, wearing a shapeless blue dress that strained at the seams, her arms crossed defiantly over her chest. Her face, already red from the heat of the day, darkened further when her gaze locked onto Lauren. There was no sign of remorse, no flicker of uncertainty, only stubborn, simmering hatred. Lauren forced herself to look away. Giving Karen her attention was giving her power, and Lauren had promised herself that today she would take that power back. When the judge entered, a stern woman in her 50s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, the room settled into a tense hush. Michelle opened the proceedings by laying out a clear chronological account of the harassment Lauren had endured, beginning with the physical assault on Evie and continuing through the series of retaliatory complaints, property damage, and intimidation tactics. She presented photographs, police reports, medical documentation, witness statements, and noise level logs. Every detail was meticulously ordered, irrefutable. Michelle spoke calmly but with an undercurrent of steely resolve that seemed to make the very air vibrate with gravity. Lauren sat silently beside her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, willing herself to stay composed. Karen's attorney, a smug man with slicked-back hair and a penchant for dramatic size, countered by painting Karen as a victim of an overly sensitive neighbor unwilling to adapt to community standards. He dismissed the dead flowers as unfortunate coincidence, the complaints as valid concerns, and Karen's shove of Evie as an exaggerated misunderstanding between a frail older woman and an out-of-control child. Lauren felt her nails digging into the skin of her palms but refused to react, even when Karen nodded vigorously at every mischaracterization of events. The judge asked pointed questions, scrutinizing every claim, every piece of evidence. It quickly became clear that she had no patience for theatrics. Facts mattered here. Proof mattered. When it was Karen's turn to testify, she shuffled to the stand and launched into a rambling, self-pitying monologue about how she had sacrificed for the community, how she had only ever wanted peace, and how Lauren's arrival had disrupted the neighborhood's delicate balance. She spoke of noise, of disrespect, of feeling threatened by a 10-year-old child on a pink bicycle. Her voice rose higher and shriller as she spoke, her words slipping from defensiveness into bitterness, from justification into open hostility. When Michelle cross-examined her, calmly pointing out inconsistencies and contradictions, Karen's temper finally snapped. "You don't understand," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Lauren. "She's not one of us. She doesn't belong here. Her kind ruins everything." The courtroom went deathly still. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, her voice like a whip crack in the silence, "I would advise you to consider very carefully what you say next." Karen clamped her mouth shut, but the damage was done. Whatever sympathy she might have hoped to garner had evaporated with that one outburst. Lauren sat back in her chair, heart pounding not from fear but from a strange, almost disbelieving relief. Karen had shown her true face at last, not just to Lauren, but to the court. When closing arguments concluded, the judge recessed for what felt like an eternity. Lauren and Michelle sat together in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, sipping bad coffee from paper cups. Michelle was confident but cautious. "Judges don't like neighbors who weaponize the system," she said, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. "And they definitely don't like defendants who lose control on the stand." When the judge returned and delivered her ruling, Lauren felt every nerve in her body tense in anticipation. The judge granted the restraining order, prohibiting Karen from coming within 200 yards of Lauren's property or Evie's school. She also issued a formal censure against Karen for filing frivolous complaints and referred the matter to the town's Code Enforcement Review Board for further investigation. The words barely registered at first. Lauren sat frozen, blinking as the reality settled over her like warm sunlight breaking through a thundercloud. She had won. Not just the battle, but the right to live without fear, without constant, creeping dread of what fresh cruelty might be waiting around the next corner. Karen, meanwhile, exploded into a fit of sputtering rage that her lawyer struggled to contain. She stormed out of the courtroom, muttering under her breath, her face a blotchy mask of defeat and impotent fury. Lauren stayed seated for a long moment after the room emptied, letting the silence wash over her. She was shaking, she realized, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the massive, dizzying release of tension that had gripped her for weeks, maybe longer. Michelle touched her arm lightly. "It's not over," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "People like her don't give up easily. She may find other ways to make life difficult. But now you have the law on your side." Lauren nodded. She understood. This was not a fairy tale ending. Karen would still be her neighbor for now. The damage Karen had done, to her business, to her sense of safety, would not disappear overnight. But for the first time, Lauren felt like she was standing on solid ground, not sinking sand. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and hot, the sky an impossible shade of blue. Lauren and Michelle walked to their cars in silence, the hum of cicadas filling the air. Before getting in, Michelle turned to Lauren and smiled faintly. "You fought the right way," she said. That matters. As Lauren drove home, she passed Karen's house and saw the curtains twitch violently as if Karen had been watching for her return. Lauren did not slow down. She did not wave or glare or give any acknowledgement at all. She simply drove past, her eyes fixed firmly ahead. At home, Evie met her at the door, her face lighting up with a hopeful, questioning smile. Lauren knelt and pulled her into a fierce hug, feeling the thin, bird-like bones of her daughter's shoulders beneath her hands. "It's over, baby," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." Evie grinned and pulled back just enough to look up at her. "Does that mean I can ride my bike again?" Lauren laughed, the sound bubbling out of her, raw and real. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can." That evening, as twilight softened the edges of the world, Lauren sat on the porch watching Evie ride slow, careful circles on the sidewalk. The pink bicycle gleamed in the fading light, a small, stubborn beacon of defiance and hope. Karen's porch remained dark and silent, her anger locked behind closed doors where it could no longer touch them. For the first time in a long time, Lauren allowed herself to believe it. They had survived the storm. They had found their way back to the light, and no matter what else Karen might try, she would never again be able to drag them back into the dark. The weeks following the court decision lulled Lauren into a fragile peace, a quiet so tense that it seemed to hum just beneath the surface of everyday life. There were no new complaints filed, no shouting matches across the street, no more overturned garbage bins or dead flowers mysteriously appearing on her lawn. Karen's house sat like a dark, brooding monument to resentment, its curtains always drawn, its driveway perpetually empty except for her rusted, dented Buick. Lauren allowed herself to believe, just for a little while, that maybe, somehow, the legal victory had been enough to break Karen's will. Maybe the restraining order, the public humiliation in court, had accomplished what months of personal endurance could not. She resumed her routines, working in her garden, reopening her flower stall at the Saturday market, helping Evie with homework, and began to reclaim pieces of the life Karen had tried so hard to tear apart. But deep down, Lauren knew better. Karen was not the type to admit defeat gracefully. And, true to form, she did not stay silent for long. It started subtly at first, with small things that were easy to dismiss if Lauren hadn't been conditioned to notice every nuance. Flyers advertising Lauren's flower business were torn down from bulletin boards around town, often within hours of being posted. A few of her regular customers stopped coming by the market, offering vague, uncomfortable excuses when Lauren ran into them at the grocery store. Whispered conversations seemed to halt abruptly whenever she entered a room. At first, Lauren tried to rationalize it. Maybe people were busy, maybe she was imagining the quick glances and tight smiles, but the cumulative weight of it soon became impossible to ignore. Karen, unable to reach Lauren directly due to the restraining order, had found another weapon: social sabotage. Rumors began circulating that Lauren was unstable, that she had attacked Karen for no reason, that she was a troublemaker, trying to stir up drama in a town that valued order and tradition. Someone created a fake Facebook profile, complete with Lauren's picture and a series of inflammatory posts criticizing local businesses and community events. The posts were crude, obvious fakes to anyone who knew her, but effective enough to sow doubt among those who didn't. Lauren reported the fake account, and Michelle filed a formal complaint linking it to the ongoing harassment, but proving Karen's involvement would be difficult without direct evidence. Meanwhile, the damage was done. Lauren's flower sales dwindled, her bookings for events dropped, and she found herself increasingly isolated in a town that once felt like a fresh start. Still, she refused to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. Instead, Lauren adapted. She shifted her focus to online sales, building a small but loyal clientele through Etsy and local delivery services. She partnered with a nearby bakery, offering bundled flour and pastry packages that slowly regained her footing in the community. It was exhausting work, made heavier by the knowledge that her battle was far from over, but it was also empowering in its own quiet way. Every small success, Every order placed was another stone laid in the foundation of a life Karen couldn't touch. But Karen was not finished escalating. One night, Lauren returned home from a late delivery to find a series of bright orange notices stapled to her front door, her mailbox, and even her fence. Citations for unpermitted landscaping, unauthorized signage, and excessive nighttime lighting. She stood frozen on the porch, reading the ludicrous charges one by one, her hands trembling with rage. The notices bore the official seal of the town's zoning department, but they were riddled with inconsistencies, wrong dates, vague accusations, and procedural errors that suggested someone had rushed them through without proper authorization. Lauren immediately contacted Michelle, who dug into the matter and discovered that the complaints had been submitted anonymously through a new community concern portal the town had launched to encourage civic engagement. It was the perfect tool for someone like Karen. Faceless, easily exploited, and difficult to trace. Worse, the town, eager to avoid liability, was required to investigate every submission, no matter how frivolous. The following morning, a code enforcement officer appeared at Lauren's door, clipboard in hand, apologetic but firm. He explained that he needed to conduct an inspection to verify the complaints. Lauren, suppressing her fury, allowed him to walk the property under her supervision. She pointed out the clearly marked property lines, the professionally installed lighting fixtures, the meticulously maintained flower beds. The officer nodded sympathetically, taking photos and notes, clearly embarrassed to be wasting both their time. After he left, Lauren felt the old familiar panic creeping back in. The fear that no matter how perfect she made things, Karen would always find a new way to twist the system against her. She wanted to scream, to tear down the notices, to march across the street and demand that Karen face her directly instead of hiding behind anonymous bureaucracy. But she didn't. She knew better now. Lauren documented everything: the notices, the inspection report, the correspondence with the zoning department. Michelle filed a motion to include the new harassment under the existing restraining order, arguing that Karen's actions violated not just the letter, but the spirit of the court's decision. Meanwhile, Lauren began to notice other strange occurrences. Twice, she found nails scattered in her driveway, positioned in such a way that running over them would almost certainly have punctured her tires if she hadn't noticed them first. Once, she caught a glimpse of a figure lurking near her backyard fence just after midnight. Too far away to identify, but too deliberate in their movements to be a coincidence. Another time, she discovered her outdoor faucet turned on full blast, flooding her flower beds with muddy water. Each incident was small, deniable, plausibly the result of accident or mischief, but taken together, they painted a chilling picture. Karen had found proxies. Whether she had enlisted sympathetic neighbors, hired local teenagers, or manipulated strangers with her sob stories, Lauren couldn't be sure. What she did know was that the threat had evolved. It was no longer just Karen standing on her porch, arms crossed and glaring. It was an invisible network of malice, diffuse and insidious. Lauren tightened her security. She installed motion-activated floodlights, upgraded her locks, and invested in a more sophisticated security camera system. She taught Evie how to stay vigilant without making her afraid, turning safety drills into games. Who could spot the unfamiliar car first? Who could remember the quickest route to a neighbor's house if needed? It wasn't the life Lauren had dreamed of when she moved to Willow Creek. It wasn't the carefree childhood she wanted for Evie, but it was survival, and for now, that had to be enough. The final blow came one rainy evening as Lauren was closing up her flower stand after a long, slow day at the market. She was loading buckets of unsold blooms into her car when a familiar voice slithered out of the shadows. "You'll never belong here, you know," Karen hissed, her bloated face barely illuminated by the dim light of a distant lamppost. She stood just outside the perimeter of the restraining order, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, her breath misting in the cold air. Lauren froze, the bucket slipping slightly in her hands. "You can win your little court cases, put up your cameras, play the victim all you want," Karen continued, her voice thick with venom. It won't change what you are. Trash. Outsider trash. For a moment, Lauren was tempted to answer, to unleash the tidal wave of rage and grief that had been building inside her for months. But then she saw Evie's face in her mind. Bright, hopeful, trusting. And she knew she couldn't afford to stoop to Karen's level. She said nothing. She simply loaded the last bucket into her car, closed the trunk with a quiet, decisive click, and drove away without a backward glance. That night, Lauren filed another police report, adding Karen's verbal harassment to the growing list of violations. Michelle submitted an emergency request to modify the restraining order, seeking to expand the distance and impose harsher penalties for future breaches. Lauren wasn't naive enough to believe that Karen would stop completely. People like her never really changed. But she understood now that victory wasn't about silencing Karen forever. It was about refusing to let her poison take root in their lives. She tucked Evie into bed that night with a kiss and a whispered promise that they were safe, that they were strong, and that no one, not even someone as bitter and broken as Karen Whitmore, could take away what they had built together. And as the rain tapped softly against the windows, Lauren allowed herself a rare, precious moment of peace, knowing that even in the face of darkness they had chosen light. And that choice made all the difference. The call came early on a Tuesday morning, when the sun was just beginning to bleed pale light over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the dew-slick streets. Lauren, still in her robe, cradling a mug of coffee in her hands, answered the phone without checking the caller ID. On the other end was Michelle, her voice brisk and urgent in a way that immediately set Lauren's nerves on edge. The town's Code Enforcement Board had concluded its investigation into the anonymous complaints filed against Lauren's property, the very complaints Karen had orchestrated with such gleeful malice, and they had found sufficient grounds to open a formal inquiry not just into Karen's activities, but into possible collusion between Karen and a former zoning official who had recently resigned under quiet but suspicious circumstances. Lauren listened, her mind racing to keep pace, as Michelle outlined what this meant. If the inquiry went forward, it could trigger criminal charges that carried real penalties, not just fines or citations, but probation, civil liability, possibly even jail time if intent to harass could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a seismic shift, one Lauren had hoped for but had hardly dared to expect. For months, she had fought to defend her home, her business, her child's innocence, armed only with patience, documentation, and an iron will forged in the quiet crucible of survival. Now, finally, the momentum was shifting. For the first time, Karen Whitmore stood not as the accuser, but as the accused. Within days, the atmosphere around Willow Creek began to change. Town officials who had once been coolly indifferent to Lauren's concerns suddenly became solicitous, careful, as if sensing the winds had shifted and not wanting to be caught on the wrong side of them. Neighbors who had avoided Lauren at the grocery store now nodded stiffly, awkwardly, as if trying to erase months of complicity with a single gesture. Gossip swirled like autumn leaves. Rumors of Karen's legal troubles, whispered speculations about corruption in the town offices, dark laughter at the idea of Karen facing consequences after years of unchecked bullying. Lauren did not celebrate. She moved through those days with the same quiet focus that had carried her through every setback, every humiliation. She continued working, continued tending her garden, continued riding her bike alongside Evie in the late afternoons when the streets grew cool and empty. She understood, more than ever, that victory was not a moment of triumph but a process, a series of small, steady steps toward reclaiming what had been stolen. Karen, by contrast, seemed to unravel before everyone's eyes. She stopped going to the market, stopped appearing at council meetings, stopped policing the neighborhood with her ever-watchful gaze. Her house fell into disrepair, grass growing tall, paint peeling from the porch railings. Packages accumulated on her doorstep, untouched. At night, Lauren sometimes saw the flicker of blue light from a television screen behind Karen's drawn curtains, but otherwise, the house sat in silence, a monument to isolation and defeat. Then, one evening, just as the last blush of sunset faded from the sky, Lauren found herself standing at her mailbox, sifting through a stack of bills and flyers, when she heard the slow, shuffling approach of heavy footsteps on the sidewalk. She turned and found Karen there, not crossing the street or staying within the thin safety of her property line, but standing bare and exposed just a few feet away. Karen looked worse than Lauren had ever seen her, disheveled, pale, her clothes hanging loosely from her frame as if she had shrunk inside them. Her face, once flushed with the heat of righteous indignation, was now blotchy and sagging, her eyes bloodshot and glassy. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the humid evening air thick with everything unsaid between them. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice low and hoarse. "You think you've won, don't you?" It wasn't the triumphant sneer Lauren had come to expect, nor the shrieking outrage. It was something smaller, more pitiful, stripped of all pretense. Lauren said nothing. She simply met Karen's gaze, steady and unflinching, refusing to offer the satisfaction of a reaction. Karen shook her head slowly, her jowls trembling with the effort. "You don't belong here," she muttered almost to herself. "People like you never do." Then she turned and shuffled back across the street, her steps slow and shuffling like a woman twice her age. Lauren watched her go, the heavy weight of pity mingling with the deeper, colder satisfaction of justice served, not through revenge or rage, but through the slow, relentless force of consequences. The next day, official notices went up around Willow Creek, announcing a special council meeting to discuss reforms to the town's complaint system and code enforcement processes. It was clear to everyone, though no names were mentioned, that the reforms were a direct result of the inquiry into Karen's actions. Lauren attended the meeting, sitting quietly in the back as proposals were discussed. Stricter oversight, penalties for false complaints, protections for victims of harassment. She spoke only once, standing briefly to thank the council for addressing the issues and expressing hope that no future resident would have to endure what she and her daughter had endured. The applause that followed was tentative at first, then grew into something warmer, stronger. It was not a roaring ovation, not a sweeping vindication, but it was enough. Later, as Lauren walked home under the cool, clear stars, Evie skipping ahead of her, laughing and twirling in the crisp autumn air, she allowed herself to believe that they had finally, truly turned a corner. That the shadows Karen had cast over their lives were finally beginning to lift. There would be other battles, of course. Life was never as simple as winning or losing, but for now, in this moment, Lauren chose to hold on to the small, stubborn flame of hope she had carried through every storm. Karen Whitmore's reign of terror was over, and Lauren Brooks was still standing. As winter bled into spring and the days grew longer and lighter, Lauren Brooks finally allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. Willow Creek blossomed again with the season's change, sidewalks lined with bursts of daffodils and lilac trees heavy with new blooms, and life settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in what seemed like forever, almost normal. Evie raced her pink bicycle up and down the street with other children, shrieking with laughter, her hair flying behind her like a comet's tail, and Lauren sat on the porch watching her, sipping tea from a chipped mug and feeling the unfamiliar, precious sensation of genuine peace unfurling in her chest. The silence from across the street had become its own kind of comfort. Karen's house remained dark, the curtains perpetually drawn, and though Lauren occasionally caught a glimpse of her lumbering through the yard or shuffling out to retrieve mail, the woman had become a ghost of the fury she had once embodied, a hollow shell retreating further into her own bitterness. Word spread quietly but surely through town that Karen had been fined for her false complaints, stripped of her influence in local circles, and informally ostracized by the community she had once sought to control with such an iron grip. No one said it aloud, of course. Politeness and propriety were still valued currencies in Willow Creek, but invitations that once found their way to Karen's mailbox now bypassed her entirely, and those who had once eagerly traded gossip on her porch now crossed the street to avoid any awkward encounters. Lauren did not rejoice in Karen's downfall, nor did she pity her. It simply was what it was, the natural consequence of a life spent sowing malice. One crisp Saturday morning, Lauren organized a small gathering on her front lawn to celebrate the first anniversary of moving to Willow Creek, a milestone that once seemed impossibly distant. She invited the neighbors who had stood by her during the darkest months, the bakery owner who had partnered with her for flour deliveries, the elderly couple who had given sworn statements against Karen's harassment. Evie helped string up colorful paper lanterns in the trees, her cheeks flushed with excitement, while Lauren laid out trays of cookies and pitchers of lemonade on a long folding table draped in a cheerful floral cloth. It wasn't a grand affair, just a simple acknowledgement that they had endured, that they were still here, thriving despite everything. As the guests arrived, laughter and conversation filled the air, weaving through the blooming azaleas and over the fresh-cut grass. Lauren moved among them, accepting hugs and congratulations with a gracious smile, feeling the heavy layers of fear and isolation finally peeling away, replaced by a warm, steady certainty that she and Evie belonged here, that this place was there, home now in a way that no amount of hatred could ever erase. Near the end of the afternoon, as the sky blushed pink with the setting sun, Lauren stood for a moment alone at the edge of her yard, gazing across the street. Karen's house sat in shadow, silent and watchful. A curtain stirred slightly in one of the windows, and Lauren thought she saw a flash of pale face, a glint of resentful eyes. For a fleeting second, she felt the old stirrings of anger, of unease, rise up in her chest. But then Evie called out to her, waving a paper plate piled high with cookies, and Lauren turned away without hesitation, crossing back to the crowd of friends and neighbors who welcomed her with open arms. That night, after the last guests had drifted home and Evie had collapsed into bed exhausted but happy, Lauren sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a soft blanket, the remnants of the celebration still littering the yard. She listened to the gentle creak of the porch swing, the chirp of crickets tuning their nighttime symphony, and thought about everything that had brought them to this point. The fear, the rage, the battles fought with courts and paperwork and sheer, stubborn will. It had not been easy. It had not been fair. And yet here she was, stronger and more certain of herself than she had ever been before. She thought about Karen, not with hate, but with a kind of detached sadness. She wondered what had twisted the woman into someone so consumed by bitterness, someone who saw in a child's laughter not joy but threat. But Lauren knew that was not her burden to carry. Karen's demons belonged to Karen alone. For Lauren and Evie, the future stretched ahead wide and welcoming, a road paved not with fear, but with possibility. Tomorrow they would plant new flowers in the garden, bright sprays of color that would reach toward the sun, unbothered by the shadows that lurked beyond the fence line. Tomorrow, Evie would ride her bike down the sidewalk without looking over her shoulder. Tomorrow, Lauren would open the windows and let the breeze carry the scent of fresh earth and hope into every corner of their little house. Tomorrow would be theirs. And no one, not the ghosts of the past, not the bitterness of others, not even the quiet hatred of a neighbor across the street, would ever take that away again.